In June 1775, Congress commissioned George Washington to take command of the Continental Army besieging the British in Boston. He wrote home to Martha that he expected to return safely to her in the fall. The command kept him away from Mount Vernon for more than 8 years. It was a command for which his military background, although greater than that of any of the other available candidates, hardly prepared him. His knowledge lay in frontier warfare, involving relatively small numbers of soldiers. He had no practical experience maneuvering large formations, handling cavalry or artillery, or maintaining supply lines adequate to support thousands of men in the field. He learned on the job, and although his army reeled from one misfortune to another, he had the courage, determination, and mental agility to keep the American cause one step ahead of complete disintegration until he figured out how to win the unprecedented revolutionary struggle he was leading. His task was not overwhelming at first. The British position in Boston was untenable, and in March 1776 they withdrew from the city. But it was only a temporary respite. In June a new British army, under the command of Sir William Howe, arrived in the colonies with orders to take New York City. Howe commanded the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas. Defending New York was almost impossible. An island city, New York is surrounded by a maze of waterways that gave a substantial advantage to an attacker with naval superiority. Howe's army was larger, better equipped, and far better trained than Washington's. They defeated Washington's army at Long Island in August and routed the Americans a few weeks later at Kip's Bay, resulting in the loss of the city. Forced to retreat northward, Washington was defeated again at White Plains. The American defense of New York City came to a humiliating conclusion on November 16, 1776, with the surrender of Fort Washington and some 2,800 men. Washington ordered his army to retreat across New Jersey. The remains of his forces, mud-soaked and exhausted, crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 7. The British had good reason to believe that the American rebellion would be over in a few months and that Congress would seek peace rather than face complete subjugation of the colonies. The enlistments of most of Washington's army were due to expire at the end of December. However, instead of crushing the remains of Washington's army, Howe went into winter quarters, with advanced garrisons at Trenton and Princeton, leaving Washington open to execute one of the most daring military operations in American history. On Christmas night Washington's troops crossed the Delaware and attacked the unsuspecting garrison at Trenton, forcing it to surrender. A few days later Washington again crossed the Delaware, outmaneuvered the force sent to crush him, and fell on the enemy at Princeton, inflicting a humiliating loss on the British. Video: Trenton-Princeton Campaign.
George Washington was the first president of America. He helped to establish the federal government and aspired to create a free, democratic, and united country. He was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and was the eldest son of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, who were prosperous Virginia gentry of English descent. George Washington died on Saturday, December 14, 1799, at his Mount Vernon estate in Virginia. The career of George Washington included the roles of a surveyor, farmer, soldier, politician, and statesman. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He became the first president of America in 1789 and served for 8 years until 1797. George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759. She was a wealthy widow with 2 children whose names were Jackie and Patsy. George and Martha never had any children together. George Washington belonged to the Federalist political party. He was 57 years old when he was inaugurated as the first American president. John Adams stood as the vice president. He was the only president who was unanimously elected and ran unopposed for both his terms of office. He was descended from English royalty and became one of the richest men in America, owning a considerable number of slaves. He was an imposing figure, standing at 6 feet 1.5 inches. He was also a brave commander and fought in the wars against the French and Indians. In recognition of his lifetime achievements, George Washington has appeared on the 25-cent piece since 1932. During his lifetime, he played a key role in major events of the era. George Washington was instrumental in the American Revolution, in which the American colonists won independence from British rule, the 1791 Bill of Rights, and forming the Constitution of the USA. During his life, George Washington suffered from malaria, smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia. This was not unusual for this time period, as medical knowledge was in its infancy. What is surprising is that he survived these illnesses and lived to the age of 67. He died of pneumonia together with an infection of the larynx that resulted in suffocation on December 14, 1799, at his Mount Vernon estate. On the centenary of his death, there was a move to have his body moved to a crypt in Washington, but this idea was strongly resisted in the South, and he was therefore placed in a new, bigger tomb at Mount Vernon. The key to the tomb was symbolically thrown into the Potomac River. So ends our short biography about the life and presidency of George Washington, the first president of America.
George Washington led the Continental Army to victory over Great Britain in the American Revolutionary War. He served as the first President of the United States, presided over the writing of the Constitution, and established a cabinet system. In young adulthood, Washington was given the rank of Major in the Virginia militia, and after successfully delivering a message to a French commander demanding that he and his soldiers leave Virginia territory, Major Washington made an arduous 900-mile journey back, earning him an international reputation after the hardships he endured were published both in Williamsburg and London. As a lieutenant colonel, a campaign to assert Virginia's territorial claims ended in humiliation for Washington, after surrendering to the French at Fort Necessity, thus igniting the French and Indian War. He relinquished his commission, but later aided General Edward Braddock, who had been sent by the King of England to force the French from the Ohio territories. Washington's bravery earned him command of Virginia's entire military force. In 1774 he was made a Virginia representative to the Continental Congress, and in June of 1775 George Washington was commissioned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. In March of 1776 the British withdrew from Boston. A new British army under the command of Sir William Howard descended on New York City. Washington ordered his army to retreat across New Jersey. They crossed the Delaware River in the dead of winter and defeated the British in 2 battles, retaking New Jersey. Revolutionary forces captured 2 major British armies at Saratoga in 1777 and Yorktown in 1781. Washington later presided over the United States Constitution in 1787, and in 1789 George Washington was elected as the first President of the United States. During his presidency, George Washington improved infrastructure, promoted commerce, and created a sense of nationalism. After his death in 1799, George Washington was hailed as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen.